It was an ordinary summer morning in Rexburg, Idaho. The kind of morning where the wind moved gently through the trees, where the world felt still, untouched. But for the group of law enforcement officers standing in the backyard of a quiet, unremarkable home, there was no peace to be found. The air was heavy with anticipation. They had been here before, searching, questioning, hoping for answers. But on this day, June 9th, 2020, the search was different. There were no more distractions, no more empty reassurances, no more excuses from the man who owned this property. This time, they had reason to believe they would find what they had been looking for. And they did. A patch of earth near a fire pit had drawn their attention. The ground was uneven, slightly raised, disturbed in a way that nature wouldn't allow on its own. It was the first sign, subtle but unmistakable. The first officer to step forward inhaled deeply, steadying himself before driving his shovel into the soft soil. The dirt gave way too easily. The men exchanged glances. They didn't need words. They had been on enough searches to know what it meant when the ground didn't resist. The digging continued, careful, deliberate. Then, a dull scraping sound, something beneath the surface. Not rock, not root, something foreign to the earth. And then, as the loose dirt was brushed away, the first true horror revealed itself. A piece of plastic. It was thin, wrinkled, weathered by months underground, but it was unmistakable. Someone had wrapped something they had not wanted the world to see. Gloves were tightened, tools were set aside. The hands that reached into the earth now were not those of searchers, but of caretakers. They knew what they were about to find, and they approached it with the solemnity it deserved. And then, a tuft of brown hair. A silence fell over the team. Not the silence of shock, not even the silence of grief. It was the silence of confirmation. The worst had come true. The plastic was carefully peeled away, revealing the small, fragile body of a child. A little boy. His arms had been bound to his sides with duct tape, his mouth covered as though even in death. His voice had to be silenced. He had been buried as though he were nothing more than an object, discarded, hidden beneath the feet of a man who once called himself a prophet. This was J.J. Vallow, 7 years old, innocent, defenseless, murdered. But the horror was not over, because the officers knew they weren't just searching for one child. A second area of disturbed ground had already been marked. A short distance away, near a patch of trees, the digging began again. But this time it wasn't a body they found. It was something worse. Fragments, pieces. The remains of a human being, burned beyond recognition. A forensic team would later confirm what those standing there already knew. This was Tylee Ryan, 17 years old, strong-willed, fiercely protective of her little brother. She had not been given the dignity of a burial. She had been mutilated, dismembered, destroyed. The officers stood motionless, staring down at the unspeakable crime before them. They had seen death before. But this was something different. The weight of what they had uncovered settled over them like a suffocating fog. For months, the world had asked, "Where are the children?" Now, they had their answer. And standing not far away, watching in silence, was Chad Daybell, the man who owned this land, the man who had built a life preaching about good and evil, light and dark, the man who claimed to speak for God. Perhaps in that moment he understood that his time was up. As officers moved toward him, he didn't resist. He didn't speak. He barely reacted. Maybe he had convinced himself he would never be caught. Maybe he had believed the world would accept his twisted version of reality. But reality had finally caught up to him. He was placed in handcuffs, his fate sealed. At first, the charge was simply concealing evidence. But it would not stop there. Because with the discovery of those bodies, the world now knew what Chad Daybell had tried so hard to hide. This was not just a case of missing children. This was something far more sinister. 2 innocent lives had been stolen. And the man who called himself a prophet had buried the proof in his own backyard. Now he would stand trial for murder. And for the first time, he would have to face the truth. To those who knew Chad Daybell before the world did, he was an unremarkable man. A former cemetery groundskeeper, a father of 5, a self-published author whose books told stories of the end times, of angels and demons, of chosen ones who could see beyond the veil of death. To his followers, he was something more. A visionary. A man who claimed to have one foot in this world and the other in the next. A man who said he could see when people would die, and, more importantly, who no longer belonged in the land of the living. But beneath the surface of his so-called divine gifts was something far more dangerous. Chad Daybell did not just believe the end of the world was coming. He believed it had already begun, and he was at the center of it. For years, Chad had written about apocalyptic battles. He had described how certain people were not really themselves, but had been possessed by dark spirits, replaced by something inhuman. He called them zombies, and he believed that once a person had become a zombie, there was only one way to free their soul: by killing them. It was a belief that might have stayed confined to the pages of his books, to the late-night conversations with like-minded followers. But in 2018, Chad met a woman who would take those beliefs and turn them into something far more real. Her name was Vallow. A mother of 3, a former beauty queen, a woman who, by all outward appearances, lived a normal life. But something had been waiting beneath the surface. And when she met Chad Daybell, that darkness was finally given permission to come out. Within weeks of their first meeting, Lori and Chad were inseparable. They exchanged secret messages. They spoke about past lives, about gods and warriors, about their divine mission. And then, Chad told Lori something that changed everything. Her husband, Charles Vallow, was a zombie. He was dark. His spirit had left his body. The man she had married no longer existed. And if that was true, then his life no longer had value. Just months later, Charles Vallow was dead, shot by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, labeled as self-defense, and quickly forgotten by the woman who had once called him the love of her life. But one death was not enough. Because soon, Chad and Lori set their sights on others. Lori's daughter, Tylee, her little boy, JJ, even Chad's own wife, Tammy Daybell. One by one, they were labeled as dark. One by one, they were marked for removal. And when they were gone, Chad and Lori did not mourn. They did not grieve. Instead, they fled to Hawaii, walking the beaches in wedding clothes, smiling for the cameras, convinced that their new world had already begun. For a time, they believed they had gotten away with it. But prophecy does not change reality. And no amount of self-proclaimed visions could erase what had already been done. Because death leaves evidence. And in June of 2020, that evidence was found. The bodies of Tylee and JJ were no longer just missing. They were recovered, identified, murdered, and the man who had claimed to see the future, who had declared himself a prophet of the end times, was now facing the one fate he had never predicted. A courtroom, a trial, a jury, and a reckoning that no vision could escape. In the fall of 2019, 2 children vanished. No public announcement, no Amber Alert, no desperate pleas from their mother, just silence. 17-year-old Tylee Ryan and her little brother, 7-year-old JJ Vallow, were last seen in September of that year. Their mother, Lori Vallow, offered simple, almost dismissive explanations whenever someone asked where they were. Tylee, she was off at college. JJ, he was staying with a friend. But there was one problem. None of it was true. For months, the world did not realize the danger these children were in. But there were people who suspected, people who had begun to see the cracks in Lori's carefully constructed lies. And by the time the truth was uncovered, it was too late. Tylee's last days. Tylee Ryan had always been fiercely independent. She had to be. She had spent most of her life watching over her younger brother, shielding him from the chaos that followed their mother from one relationship to the next. But in the final months of her life, that chaos became something else. Something darker. On September 8, 2019, Tylee went on what should have been an ordinary family outing, a trip to Yellowstone National Park. Photographs captured her smiling, standing beside her mother, her little brother, and her uncle, Alex Cox. No one knew it at the time, but this was the last time Tylee would ever be seen alive. After that day, she was gone. No texts, no phone calls, no social media activity. And when her friends tried to reach out, they didn't get Tylee, they got Lori. Short, vague messages. Explanations that didn't feel right, excuses that didn't make sense, and then silence. Tylee had disappeared. JJ's final goodbye, but JJ Vallow was still alive, at least for a little while. Unlike Tylee, JJ's absence was noticed almost immediately. The 7-year-old had been enrolled at a local school, and on September 23, 2019, he attended class as usual. He played with his classmates, he laughed, he learned. It was just another day. But it was also his last. Because the very next morning, Lori called the school and told them JJ would not be returning. She said she had decided to homeschool him. That was a lie. Because JJ Vallow would never step into a classroom again. In the days that followed, Lori told different people different stories. She told some that JJ was with a family friend. She told others that he had been sent away for his own safety. But behind closed doors, something far more sinister was happening. On the night of September 22nd, Lori's close friend, Melanie Gibb, had been staying at her home. She had seen JJ that evening. But something was wrong. The little boy, usually so full of energy, seemed sedated, unable to stand properly. Alex Cox, Lori's brother, carried him upstairs. That was the last time anyone outside of Lori's inner circle saw JJ Vallow alive. By the next morning, he was gone. And when Melanie asked where he was, Lori simply smiled. He had to go. No further explanation, no concern. Just the same eerie, unwavering calm that she always had when someone disappeared from her life. The web of lies. For weeks, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell acted as though nothing had changed. They traveled freely. They attended religious gatherings. They spent time with followers who hung on their every word, believing them to be something greater than they were. But back home, the questions were beginning to mount. JJ's grandparents, Kay and Larry Woodcock, were growing suspicious. They hadn't heard from their grandson. They hadn't spoken to him. Something was wrong. And in November 2019, they made a call that changed everything. They contacted the police. A welfare check was requested. And suddenly, Lori Vallow found herself face to face with the one thing she had been trying to avoid. Accountability. When officers knocked on her door, she greeted them with a smile. She assured them JJ was fine. She told them he was staying with a friend. But when police followed up, they quickly discovered the truth. JJ was not with a friend. He was not safe. And within hours of the welfare check, Lori had packed up her belongings and fled the state. She ran, because she knew what the world would soon discover. Her children weren't just missing. They were dead. And no matter how far she went, no matter how many lies she told, there was one thing she could not outrun. The truth. Tammy Daybell had spent nearly 3 decades building a life with Chad. She was a mother of 5, a school librarian, and by all accounts, a kind and devoted wife. She had no idea she had been marked for death. For years, Chad had preached about the coming apocalypse, the battle between light and dark. But as his beliefs grew more extreme, they also became more personal. And soon his wife, the woman who had stood by him, supported him, built a life with him, became an obstacle. Because there was someone else. Lori Vallow. By the summer of 2019, Chad and Lori had already convinced themselves they were soulmates, destined to be together. Bound by divine will, there was just one problem: Tammy. Chad couldn't simply leave her. That wasn't part of the plan. Divorce wasn't an option. Not in his twisted version of faith, but death. That was something different. And so he did what he had done before. He labeled her dark. He claimed her soul had already left her body, that she was no longer who she once was, that the woman he had married had been replaced, and once someone was dark, their fate was sealed. The first attempt. On the night of October 9, 2019, Tammy was home alone when she stepped outside and came face to face with a masked gunman, a man dressed in black, pointing a rifle at her. She would later tell police that she thought it was a prank at first, that it had to be some kind of joke. But then the trigger was pulled. The gun misfired. Tammy screamed. She ran back inside, and just like that, the attacker vanished into the night. She told Chad what had happened. She told friends and family. She even posted about it online. But there was one detail she didn't know. The attempted shooter was not some random stranger. It was Alex Cox, Lori's brother, the same man who had shot and killed Charles Vallow just months earlier. But this time, he had failed. And that failure would not be forgiven. 10 days later, Tammy Daybell did not live to see Halloween. On the morning of October 19, 2019, Chad called 911. His voice was calm, almost emotionless. His wife, he said, had died in her sleep. A peaceful death. Unexpected, but natural. That was the story. And because Tammy was only 49 years old, because she had never been seriously ill, the suddenness of it all should have raised questions. But it didn't. Chad insisted there was no need for an autopsy. And within days, Tammy was buried. Her children were left with nothing but questions. Her friends were left in shock. But Chad? He moved on. A sudden wedding. 17 days. That's how long it took Chad Daybell to marry Lori Vallow. 17 days after burying his wife, he was standing on a beach in Hawaii, exchanging vows with another woman. No mourning, no hesitation, no time for grief, just a new life, a fresh start. To Chad and Lori, there was nothing unusual about it. Tammy had been dark. Tammy had been a zombie. In their minds, she had never really died because she had already been gone. But the world did not see it that way. People were beginning to talk. The speed of Chad's remarriage was suspicious. The deaths surrounding Lori were stacking up. And just as the bodies of Tylee and JJ would later be uncovered, so too would the truth about Tammy. In December 2019, authorities exhumed her remains. And when an autopsy was finally performed, the truth was undeniable. Tammy Daybell had not died in her sleep. She had been murdered. And the man who had once promised to love her in this life and the next was the one who had orchestrated her death. Now, Chad Daybell was no longer just a grieving widower. He was a suspect, and soon he would be something else, a man on trial for his life. For months, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow believed they had won. They had erased their pasts. The children were gone. Tammy was buried. The obstacles had been removed. And now they were free. Hawaii became their paradise, an escape from the questions that were beginning to circle back in Idaho and Arizona. They spent their days walking the beaches, smiling, celebrating their new life together. They thought they were untouchable, but they weren't. Because even as they basked in their twisted version of a happy ending, others were watching. And the truth, no matter how deeply buried, was starting to rise. The grandparents fight for justice. While Chad and Lori were lost in their delusions, Kay and Larry Woodcock were refusing to let JJ's memory fade into silence. They were the first to sound the alarm, the first to demand answers. It had been months since they had spoken to JJ, and Lori's shifting, empty explanations weren't enough. They wanted proof that their grandson was safe. But there was no proof, because JJ wasn't safe, and neither was Tylee. So they called the police. They begged for a welfare check. And when officers knocked on Lori's door in Rexburg, Idaho in late November 2019, her reaction was not one of a concerned mother. She smiled, she laughed, she assured them everything was fine. JJ, she said, was with a friend in Arizona. It was a lie. And by the time police followed up, by the time they realized they had been deceived, Lori and Chad were gone. They had fled. Disappearing overnight, leaving behind a town filled with questions, a trail of secrets, and no trace of the missing children. A nationwide manhunt. When the news broke that JJ and Tylee were missing, it spread like wildfire. The media descended. The FBI got involved. Investigators from multiple states worked together, piecing together the movements of Lori and Chad, unraveling the strange, tangled web of doomsday prophecies, secret societies, and unexplained deaths. And the more they uncovered, the more chilling the story became. Charles Vallow, dead. Tammy Daybell, dead. Tylee and JJ, missing. And at the center of it all, Lori and Chad. But the couple didn't seem worried. They were in Hawaii, living as if none of it mattered. It was as if they had convinced themselves that their prophecies had come true, that their mission had been completed, that the world would never touch them, that the world was watching. And soon, it was coming for them. Lori's arrest on February 20th, 2020. Lori Vallow was arrested in Kauai, Hawaii. She had been given every chance to tell the truth, to reveal where her children were. Instead, she had remained silent. So now, she was facing the consequences. The charges at first were simple: desertion and non-support of dependent children. But everyone knew it was bigger than that. JJ and Tylee were still missing, and for the first time the world was starting to suspect the truth. That they weren't coming back, but there was still no proof, no bodies, no hard evidence, just suspicion. And that was not enough. Not yet. But investigators were getting closer. Closer to the truth, closer to the graves that Chad and Lori had worked so hard to keep hidden. And once those graves were found, there would be no escaping justice. For nearly a year, the world asked the same question: where were Tylee and JJ? Their faces were on every news channel, every missing persons poster, every desperate plea from their grandparents. But Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow refused to answer. They sat in silence, watching from behind the walls of their delusions. And for months there was no proof, no bodies, no crime scene, no definitive evidence that the worst had happened. But the investigators were relentless. They had studied Chad and Lori's movements, traced their footsteps, scoured their messages, and every clue pointed back to one place: Chad's backyard. The search warrant, June 9, 2020. A quiet morning in Salem, Idaho. Chad Daybell was inside his home when he saw the first police vehicle pull up, then another, and another. Then the FBI, and the cadaver dogs. They had come with a warrant, they had come with shovels, they had come to dig. The search was slow, methodical. The dogs were led across the property, sniffing, pausing, alerting, then a reaction. A patch of disturbed earth. The digging began, and soon the awful truth was unearthed. The remains of J.J. Vallow. The first body was small, wrapped in plastic, bound with duct tape, a child, his little arms restrained, his head covered. 7-year-old J.J. Vallow had been buried in a shallow grave just feet from the Daybell home. Discarded, hidden, erased, until now. And just a few yards away, under another patch of disturbed soil, the second grave was waiting. The horror of Tylee's fate. Tylee Ryan was 17, but there would be no body to exhume. What the search team found was something far worse. Charred flesh, scattered bones, pieces of a human being, burned, dismembered, unrecognizable. Tylee had not been simply buried, she had been destroyed. The level of brutality was staggering, and yet Chad Daybell had gone about his life as if nothing had happened, as if 2 children had not been killed on his land, as if their bodies had not been hidden under his feet, as if the truth would never be uncovered. But now, the truth was out, and the world saw Chad Daybell for what he truly was. Not a prophet, not a leader, not a chosen messenger, a killer. And as the search team placed J.J. and Tylee's remains into body bags, as the flashing lights reflected off the dirt, as the weight of what had happened settled over that small town, Chad Daybell did something for the first time. He ran. The arrest of Chad Daybell. It wasn't far. He didn't have time to get far. When police caught him, he was in his car, just down the road from his house. A coward's escape. A last, desperate attempt to flee from a fate he had written for himself. But there was no running anymore. Not from the evidence, not from the bodies, not from justice. Chad Daybell was arrested on the spot, and as he was led away in handcuffs, as the weight of reality finally settled over him, he had no visions, no prophecies, no divine messages from beyond. Only the cold, inescapable fact that the world had finally seen him for what he was. A fraud, a murderer, and soon a man on trial for his life. Chad Daybell sat behind bars, his world crumbling around him. For years he had lived inside his own twisted reality, a place where he was a prophet, a chosen leader, a man above earthly law. But now there was no escaping the real world, no hiding behind visions, no rewriting the story, because the story had already been written. And the ending was clear. He was going to stand trial for murder. The charges. The indictment was damning. First-degree murder of Tylee Ryan. First-degree murder of J.J. Vallow. First-degree murder of Tammy Daybell. Conspiracy to commit murder. Insurance fraud. And every charge painted the same picture. A man who believed he could decide who lived and who died. A man who thought he could manipulate the world to fit his own delusions. But the world was done listening to Chad Daybell. Now, the evidence would speak. The damning evidence. The prosecutors had spent months assembling their case, and when the trial came, they laid it all bare. There were the text messages, messages in which Chad and Lori discussed people being dark, their souls already gone. There were the financial records, proving that Tammy Daybell's life insurance payout had been collected just days after her death. There were the testimonies, former friends and family members recounting the bizarre, chilling words Chad had spoken. And then, there were the bodies. The burned, dismembered remains of Tylee. The plastic-wrapped corpse of J.J., his arms bound, his face covered. The exhumed body of Tammy, now proven to have been asphyxiated. Each piece of evidence was a nail in Chad Daybell's coffin, and yet through it all he sat there. Silent, unmoved, still clinging to the idea that none of this was real, that this was just another chapter in his prophecy. But there was no prophecy left, only cold, hard reality. Lori turns on Chad. For months, Chad and Lori had been a united front, but now cracks were forming. Lori Vallow had already been convicted, and as she sat behind bars, she started to shift the blame. She claimed Chad had manipulated her, that he had led her into his world of apocalyptic madness, that he was the true mastermind, the ultimate liar. She would spend the rest of her life in prison. But Chad? He was facing something even worse. Because the prosecution wasn't just seeking a conviction, they were seeking the death penalty. And if they succeeded, Chad Daybell's final prophecy would come true. Not as a chosen one, not as a leader of the 144,000, but as a man strapped to a gurney waiting for the needle. The trial was coming, and for the first time, Chad was forced to face something he had never believed in: his own mortality. The courtroom was silent as Chad Daybell took his seat. No apocalyptic prophecies, no divine messages, no grand visions of the future, just cold, hard reality. For years, he had claimed to be a man of destiny, a chosen one, a leader of the righteous, but now he was nothing more than a defendant. And across the room, the families of his victims sat, watching, waiting, determined to see justice done. The opening statements. The prosecution spoke first. They did not call him a prophet. They did not call him a leader. They called him what he was, a murderer. They laid out the evidence piece by piece: 3 bodies, a mountain of lies, a twisted belief system that justified the unthinkable. They described how Chad had manipulated Lori, how he had declared people dark, how he had decided who lived and who died, and most importantly, money, power, control. There was no divine mission, no sacred cause, just a man who wanted what he wanted, no matter who had to die to give it to him. Then came the defense. They tried to paint Chad as a misguided believer, a man who had been swept up in his own faith. They blamed Lori, they blamed Alex Cox, they blamed everyone except the man sitting at the defense table. But the jury did not see a man of faith. They saw a man who had buried 2 children in his own backyard. A man who had married his mistress just weeks after his wife's sudden death. A man who had spent years preaching about the end of the world, only to find himself at the end of the road. The testimonies. Over the next few weeks, witness after witness took the stand. There were law enforcement officers detailing how Chad had evaded questions, how he had fled when the truth got too close. There were forensic experts describing the brutality of what had been done to Tylee and JJ, the autopsy results that proved Tammy had been murdered in her own bed. And then, there were the voices of those who had once trusted Chad, former friends, former believers, people who had once looked up to him only to realize too late that he was not a prophet, but a predator. His own children testified. They had defended him at first, unable to believe their father could be capable of such things. But the evidence was undeniable, and when the time came, even they could not save him. Because the truth had been unearthed, and it was damning. The moment of truth, Chad Daybell sat motionless as the prosecution delivered its final words. They did not ask the jury to convict him based on emotion. They asked them to convict him based on the facts. 3 lives were stolen, 3 murders were planned. 3 victims were buried, their deaths covered up by a man who thought he could rewrite reality to suit himself. And now the jury had a choice: to believe the lies or to deliver justice. As the courtroom fell silent, as Chad stared straight ahead with empty eyes, there was only one question left. How much longer would he be allowed to breathe free air? The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Chad Daybell sat motionless at the defense table, his hands folded, his face as unreadable as ever. For years he had preached that he knew the future, that he could see beyond this world, that he understood the fate of others before they did. But now, for the first time, he was blind, because the only people who could decide his fate were the 12 jurors walking back into the courtroom, and they had reached a decision: the reading of the verdict. The judge called for silence. The courtroom held its breath. A clerk unfolded the paper, cleared their throat, and read the words that would define the rest of Chad Daybell's life. On the charge of first-degree murder of Tylee Ryan, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A murmur rippled through the room. On the charge of first-degree murder of J.J. Vallow, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Someone in the audience let out a muffled sob. On the charge of first-degree murder of Tammy Daybell, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Chad did not flinch. He had spoken about the end of the world for years. Now his world had truly ended. The families react. Kay and Larry Woodcock clutched each other. tears in their eyes. For months they had fought for this, for JJ, for Tylee. Tammy's family sat in silence, grief and justice intertwining in their hearts. And across the room, Lori Vallow's absence loomed like a ghost. She was already serving life in prison. Now, the man she had once called her eternal soulmate was following her into the abyss. The sentencing phase begins. But this was not over. Because Chad was not just facing life in prison, he was facing something even worse, the death penalty. The jury had already decided his guilt. Now, they had to decide if he deserved to die for what he had done. The prosecution laid out its final argument. This was not just murder. This was cold, calculated slaughter, the destruction of children, the betrayal of a wife, the corruption of faith. Chad Daybell was not insane, he was not confused, he was not misguided, he was deliberate, and that, they argued, was why he did not deserve mercy. Chad speaks for the first time. And then something happened. For the first time in the trial, Chad Daybell spoke. His voice was quiet, emotionless. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not show remorse. He spoke of visions, of dreams, of unseen forces guiding his actions. He spoke as if he were still the author of his own fate, as if he still believed the jury would listen. But they didn't, because they had already seen the truth, and soon they would give him their final answer. The answer that would determine whether Chad Daybell would die in a prison cell or in an execution chamber. The final day of the trial had arrived. For weeks, the world had watched as Chad Daybell's secrets were laid bare. Every lie, every manipulation, every horrifying crime. Now there was only one question left. Would he live or would he die? The jury's decision. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in one last time. 12 people, 12 strangers who had listened to every word, studied every piece of evidence, and seen through every lie. They had been given one final task to decide if Chad Daybell should face the ultimate punishment. The judge turned to the jury foreperson. Has the jury reached a decision? Yes, Your Honor. The paper was unfolded, a deep breath. Then, on the matter of sentencing, we, the jury, find that the aggravating factors outweigh any mitigating circumstances. We, the jury, recommend death. The final fate of Chad Daybell. For the first time, Chad blinked. No visions had warned him of this. No prophecy had predicted his own execution. The man who had spent his life preaching about the end of the world would now face his own ending, not by divine will, but by the hand of the justice system. Chad Daybell was escorted out of the courtroom in chains. He would not walk free again. His days would now be spent in the cold, empty silence of death row. No followers, no visions, no escape. Just time, long, endless time, until the final moment came. And then, nothing. Justice for the victims Tylee Ryan, JJ Vallow, Tammy Daybell. Their voices had been silenced by a man who believed he was above consequence. But in the end, justice had spoken louder than his delusions ever could. Their names would be remembered. His would be a warning. That evil disguised as faith is still evil. That those who believe they can rewrite reality will always be met with the truth. And that, no matter how long it takes, justice always comes.